Harry's Wife, A Less Than Royal Narcissist, Part 54.1. Hello, I'm H.G. Tudor, and welcome to another run through the latest news articles and observations appertaining to Harry's Wife, which provides us all with a useful opportunity to understand that behaviour through the lens of narcissism and to look at narcissism generally to increase your understanding of how it functions and operates using a real-life prominent example. I utilise a number of news articles just plucked from the internet. As always, I leave it to you to determine the veracity of the information portrayed in the news articles. My role is to provide you with the analysis so that you understand what is going on when viewed through the lens of narcissism. Also to provide you with some entertaining education at the same time. Well, let's get straight down to it, and what better way than to limber up with a bit of knock-on-knock action. And the News International brings us this headline: Piers Morgan relaunches attack on Harry's wife. As you know, I explained elsewhere, Piers Morgan's a narcissist also, and he's quite correct in his repeated identification of the hypocrisy and disbelief that he demonstrates towards Harry's wife, but understand that is motivated by his own need to assert control over her as a consequence of her repeated appearance on his own radar. Every time she appears on his radar, and she's painted black, his narcissism requires him to assert control over her, either directly, indirectly, or by a position of withdrawal. His narcissism is not selecting the direct route, presumably because either he has no means of doing that, or if he did have, for instance, if he has the telephone number for Harry's wife, she's not going to answer if she knows that it's him. And therefore, his narcissism recognises that he's likely to fail in that attempt to assert control. Remember, Piers isn't thinking that himself. He's not thinking, oh, I'm not going to telephone her because I won't be able to get control over her and she'll knock me back and wound me. But rather, he'd think, well, I'm not going to call her. I don't want to speak to her. And his narcissism guides him to assert control indirectly through his prolific tweeting, and also in the knowledge, of course, that that's then picked up by various news outlets that are keen to keep this feud running and running until another bombshell interview comes along. The News International tells us as follows: Piers Morgan does not seem to give up his habit as he renewed his controversial claims about Harry's wife's mental health, saying he still doesn't believe Harry's wife. The former Good Morning Britain presenter, who was sacked from the show for unnecessarily criticising Prince Harry's sweetheart, well, that's a matter of opinion whether it was unnecessarily criticising. Many people would say that it was entirely warranted criticism. It states that he stuck to his guns in a tweet on Monday. The controversial TV personality began Mental Health Week with a quote from Rocky Balboa that he found helpful in tough times: character trait acquisition, grandiosity, assertion of control. The post prompted one fan to ask if Piers now believes in mental health months after he was sacked from the job. He took no time to respond and said, "I believe in mental illness. I just don't believe Harry's wife." Accordingly, what happened was that Piers Morgan tweeted, and then somebody called Al, using the handle @ADTalks, replied to him stating, "So now you believe in mental health. You thought it was all made up when Harry's wife mentioned she struggled with hers. Bell end." That individual, of course, believes that they're pointing out the hypocrisy of Piers Morgan by stating, oh, so now you're advocating certain measures to tackle mental health problems, to bring awareness because it's Mental Health Week, but you said you didn't believe in it. Now, of course, that person commenting has got that incorrect. Morgan didn't say that he didn't believe in people having mental health problems. He just said that he didn't believe Harry's wife. So that individual making that assertion is incorrect. It's often the case, of course, that a narcissist will engage in hypocrisy as a consequence of our compartmentalizing behaviour. And, of course, we've seen repeatedly the hypocrisy of Piers Morgan, where he cozied up to Harry's wife in the beginning, and then as soon as he was of no use to her and she popped him back on the shelf, that threatened his control, and he turned his phasers to kill, and decided thereafter, as a consequence of the driving factor of his narcissism, to comment about her adversely. And therefore there was a hypocrisy. They were all chummy, and now they're not. However, here, Piers Morgan isn't demonstrating hypocrisy. He's remaining consistent in his message. He's never stated that he doesn't believe in mental health, he's just saying that he didn't believe Harry's wife's claims. And therefore that individual with their tweet has made a mistake. However, the reply, of course, stated as follows. So now you believe in mental health. You thought it was all made up when Harry's wife mentioned she struggled with hers. Bell end. That comment from a tertiary source in Piers Morgan's fuel matrix is challenge fuel. There is some fuel being given because he's being insulted, but it's a challenge because it's being suggested that he's a hypocrite. This will, of course, offend Mr. Morgan's sense of innate control, and therefore he's moved to respond. However, there are two factors for you to understand here. The first is that @AD Talks is threatening the control of Mr. Morgan, and therefore his narcissism has to respond to that. He can do so directly, therefore replying directly to the message. He could do so indirectly by possibly turning to his wife and saying, look at what this fuckwad has written about me. I can't believe this moron has got this wrong. And she agrees and says, don't sweat it, Piers. You know that these people are complete numpties. And therefore her agreement enables his narcissism to understand that he's got control over @AD Talks. Or he could have just ignored the individual, contemptuously dismissing them. And that is often the case for prolific narcissists who receive messages of that ilk to just dismiss them. Similarly, on my own channel, where I receive the occasional message which is looking to bait me, in some circumstances I'll assert control directly by setting that person straight. I explain to them why they are wrong, and I do so in a fair and measured way. I will top it off with a little insult because they deserve it, because they've made themselves look a complete moron, and they need to be made aware of that fact. How dare you come to my channel and try and insult me? You're not going to get away with it. But for the most part, one ignores them, because one doesn't want to necessarily give them any fuel, where I suspect that it's a narcissist that has made the comment, and therefore I ignore, meaning that I assert control, and many prominent narcissists behave in such a way. In this instance, @AD Talks has threatened Mr. Morgan's control, resulting in him needing to respond with one of the three assertions of control. But there is a second element to this, because of course Harry's wife is mentioned, which means that Harry's wife comes upon Mr. Morgan's radar, and therefore his narcissism also says, in the unconscious, we now need to assert control over Harry's wife again. Hence why this news article talks about Piers Morgan does not seem to give up his habit as he renewed his controversial claims. Quite simply, it's not because Piers has got an obsession about her, but rather because she keeps popping up on his radar, his narcissism drives him to have to respond in such way. And therefore, as a consequence of @AD Talks comment, Piers Morgan has to do two things. Driven by his unconscious narcissism, he needs to assert control over @AD Talks. His narcissism selects the direct assertion of control because he tweets back at @AD Talks, but also because Harry's wife has come up on the radar, she needs to be brought under control, and therefore he does so, asserting control with her indirectly, with in effect what would be seen as a smear. And remember, irrespective of whether the information is accurate or not, it's done because of the way the narcissist uses it to smear by the assertion of control indirectly. Mr. Morgan responded with, I believe in mental illness. I just don't believe Harry's wife. P.S. Please don't call me Bellend. It's bad for my mental health. Which, of course, is the witty response that one would expect from Mr. Morgan, and thoroughly deserves this. Well played, Mr. Morgan. 2 assertions of control in one pithy tweet. He reasserts that he doesn't believe Harry's wife, maintaining consistency in there, and therefore indirectly asserts control over her, and of course utilises the whole point about mental health in a tongue-in-cheek way, demonstrating that narcissists can also utilise humour by saying, please don't call me Bell End. It's bad for my mental health, putting at AD Talks firmly in his or her place. Narc-on-narc action again. Now, it's highly unlikely that Harry's wife will be aware of the response in terms of her monitoring Piers Morgan to see what he is talking about, but it's likely that it will be brought to her attention at some point, because one of her minions will come running to her, seeking to curry favour with her, possibly the improbably named Omid Scobie, or maybe Gale shins it over the back wall. Possibly Oprah pops round with a new chicken of authenticity tucked under her arm, or holding some eggs and wondering, why the fuck am I holding some eggs? One of those 3 or somebody else, perhaps new BFF Chrissy Teigen bowls up, utilising the opportunity for her also to leverage some control, and says, hey, look what that horrible, devilish, nasty, unpleasant man Piers Morgan has said about you now. He is so not with the programme. He's so anti-woke. We need to now galvanise the legions of wokeness and bring liberal but justified, righteous anger upon his peasy ass. So it's doubtless that this will be brought to Harry's wife attention. And, of course, how will she respond? Well, because Piers Morgan has written, I believe in mental illness, I just don't believe Harry's wife, that threatens her sense of control, because he's calling her a liar. She will not assert control over him directly by contacting him and saying, hey, Piers, what's all this about you saying that you still don't believe me? Why don't you come and sit on the bench of stench and have a good chat with me and we'll sort things out? Or why don't you pop round and sit on one of my many toilets and you can get all of the shit out of you and then we can have a proper discussion? No. She won't do that. The grandiosity of her own narcissism and the potential for a failure to assert control over him, recognised by her own unconscious narcissism, means that she's more likely to make adverse comment about him to a flunky and a minion, thus asserting control indirectly, and possibly then, dipping into the treasure chest of woke behaviours, find another worthy cause to staple her name to, with somebody else doing all of the work, so that she can then advance her mental health credentials even further. So, we kick off there with a useful observation from a short article demonstrating narc-on-narc action, the necessity of the assertion of control, the direct assertion of control, the indirect assertion of control, facade management, and the various threats to the narcissist control as the ping-pong continues between Piers Morgan and Harry's wife. Join me in part 2 for further discussion about recent news articles and analysis as to what it is all about.